The New York Giants absolutely suck, and I think it's pretty fair to say that this current regime for the New York Giants is in kind of a make or break year. So in today's video, I want to break down the New York Giants struggle and talk about what they could do moving forward to fix some of their issues. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, but let's hop right into it. So again, we're going to be talking about the New York Giants. We're going to be breaking down what this team has been struggling with and what they can look to fix. I think a good way to start the video off is just by beginning off with some general statistics to kind of set the groundwork and framework for everything we're going to talk about throughout this video. Statistically speaking, offensively wise, it's maybe the worst offense in the entire NFL because they're averaging 15.3 points per game, which is dead last in the NFL, 291.1 yards per game, which is 26th best in the NFL. They're only averaging 1.6 touchdowns per game, which is also dead last in the NFL. They also rank dead last in red zone scoring touchdown percentage, dead last in points per play, and second to last in yards per play. The only statistic they rank in the top 20, at least major offensive statistic wise, is their fourth down conversion rates. I will say if there's any sort of glimmer of hope for this offense and what this team could potentially be looking to, build upon into the upcoming seasons, it is that their ground game isn't terrible. They're averaging 4.4 yards per rush, which is 14th best in the league, and they're averaging the 15th most rushing yards a game and 18th most rushing touchdowns per game. Unfortunately, this team is down in massive deficits throughout most of their games, so they really cannot commit to the run, but when they do run the ball, they're somewhat effective. However, on defense, it's also not good, but it's a little bit better. Because defensively, they're only giving up 23.3 points per game, which puts them 18th best in the NFL. They're giving up 340.1 yards per game, which puts them at number 19. And they're giving up 2.5 touchdowns per game, which puts them 16th best in the NFL. This New York Giants defense has a couple bright spots. They do get to the quarterback at a fairly consistent rate. They actually have the second highest sack percentage, which is really good. And it does make sense because you do have guys like Azeez Ojulari, who is actually injured, but is a good player when healthy. Dexter Lawrence, one of the best players in the league. Brian Burns, and again, Kayvon Thibodeau, who hasn't had the most healthy season. We'll get to some of those guys here soon because I do think that is a unit that is going to kind of be forced to make some changes because this team has a bunch of different issues they're going to have to fix. So that's just the general statistics. Again, it just kind of sets a big, nice overview for everything that has gone wrong for this team. Let's start off with the offense and kind of go through each sort of position group and talk about which ones have been good and which ones have been bad. Starting off with quarterback, we all know Daniel Jones was a massive flop. Tommy DeVito should never be starting an NFL game, and Drew Lock is just not good enough to carry this terrible team. The only bright spot really for this offense is Tyrone Tracy Jr. and Malik Neighbors, both rookies. As I mentioned earlier with Tyrone Tracy, he's actually kind of taken the reins of the starting running back position and has looked somewhat good. Again, this Giants offense is really lacking in talent, so wherever you can find any bit of talent, you'll definitely take it. And I do think moving forward, Tracy should be given plenty of opportunities to either be the lead back or, a second option like kind of a Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery type of role where Tyrone Tracy can kind of be that big playmaker. Wide receiving core wise, it's actually not terrible. Of course, Malik Neighbors is the big name guy here, but you also do have guys like Wan'Dale Robinson, who's a bit more of a slot, undersized guy who's been okay for the team, and Darius Slayton, who's been a really solid receiver for this team the past couple years. You also do have other guys like, of course, Jalen Hyatt, who's a bit more of your speedster, but he hasn't really done much in the NFL, and truth be told, I was not a fan of him at all coming out of college, and yeah, he's been pretty bad. Tight end wise, it's also not great. They do have Daniel Bellinger, who's okay. You also do have Theo Johnson, who's on IR, but the tight end position is definitely not a strength for this team. Offensive line wise, it's been better this year, but there's also been regression in certain spots that you would want to see some progression from. For starters, Andrew Thomas is currently on IR, has had a couple injuries this year, but when healthy, he's one of the best tackles in the NFL. Jermaine Illuminor is currently playing either left tackle or right tackle. He's been fine this year, just not as good as maybe what this Giants team might have expected. John Runyon has been fine, and John Michael Schmitz is kind of the guy who I'm talking about who you want to see some progression from, but he hasn't really done that quite yet. He hasn't been necessarily bad, but he also hasn't been good. And then your right guard is Greg Van Roten. Definitely not a bright spot, but it could be a lot worse. Evan Neal was somebody you took a few years ago, and he's been an absolute bust. If there even is a definition of a bust, it would be Evan Neal. He has been so unbelievably bad. It's kind of gotten to the point where this Giants team just doesn't want to start him at all, and it's kind of really, honestly, it's kind of sad, truth be told. But yeah, the offense sucks. It needs a massive inflection of talent, and I think the biggest one is the quarterback position, which we will get to here in a little bit. Now, defensively speaking, they're dealing with a bunch of injuries, which is extremely unfortunate, but they're kind of tanking, so it's kind of to be expected. Right now, Dexter Lawrence is currently injured and is on IR, but when healthy, Dexter Lawrence is an all-pro level player, so there's not a whole lot to talk about there. Brian Burns has been fine, only has 6 sacks on the season, but he has been getting a good number of pressures. I would want to see him get home a bit more. I wouldn't necessarily say he has been living up to what they spent to get him, but at the same time, I don't want to put too much blame on him. Let's put more talent around him, and I think he'll start to produce 10, 15 plus sacks. Kayvon Thibodeaux hasn't necessarily been all that impressive this year. I believe he only has 2 sacks on the season. Yes, he's had some injuries, but when he has been out there, hasn't been playing very good. I will say this, I've never been a massive fan of Kayvon Thibodeaux, even coming out of college. I kind of viewed him as somebody who was a bit of a project and hasn't really developed a whole bunch of great pass rushing abilities. He's definitely far from a bust. He's a very solid player, but he's definitely not this 10 to 15 sack per season type of guy. Outside of that, your defensive line is pretty injured right now, pretty banged up. Azeez Ojulari is somebody who is a free agent this offseason, is very young. Maybe you bring him back. He's been pretty productive when he has been healthy. Linebackers wise, I don't think you have too many terrible issues there. You have Bobby Okereke, Micah McFadden, a bunch of other guys as well. They're good. They're not great. Bobby Okereke is still a good tackler, still a good, just solid linebacker. If you could find an upgrade, maybe you would take it, but I don't think you need to be looking for upgrades in positions like linebacker when you have so many other needs. Secondary wise, it's been a bit of a weird story. Tyler Nubin and Drew Phillips have been massive, great players for them in this recent draft. But what's been disappointing is Deonte Banks. He is terrible this year. If you look at PFF, he has an overall grade of 51.3 with a coverage grade of 50.4. He's allowed over 41 receptions, has 0 interceptions, and only 38 solo tackles. I think the interesting thing about Deonte Banks is the fact that he just doesn't look like he really looks like he cares. For somebody who is on a bad team and is probably trying to look to make their mark, Deonte Banks isn't playing up to that level. I kind of wonder if it's in his head and maybe he's just not interested because of how bad the team is, or is he just genuinely that bad because he's having a terrible year. Alongside him, you do have Cordell Flott, who you took a couple years back, who hasn't really developed that much, but isn't necessarily bad. Cornerback is a position of need moving forward. Let's just put it that way. So, okay, we talked about all the position groups, if they're good, if they're bad. What are we talking about in terms of assets? Well, fortunately for the Giants, because you are bad, you do have a relatively good amount of assets to work with. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt. I'll be really quick. I did start a brand new YouTube channel called Metro Stories. I think you guys might like it. It's a channel that we simply focus on stories of NFL players as well as NFL teams. So if you guys are interested in that, go ahead and look in the description below as well as on the pinned comment where you're going to find a link for that channel. But let's get back to the video. For starters, via Over the Cap, they have around basically a little bit less than $60 million in 2025 team cap space. And because they don't have a bunch of free agents, they should have a good amount of money to work on to go out there and acquire more free agents. They do have a couple guys who I would like to see them bring back this offseason. Guys like Darius Slayton, I don't necessarily know if he's a must bring back type of guy, but if you do want to bring him back and focus on other position groups, I would definitely understand it, especially if he does want to be a Giant. You also do have Drew Lock out there who's a solid backup. Maybe you want to bring him back on like a $5 million one-year deal just to kind of be a locker room guy as well as the backup to maybe somebody you're either going to sign or draft in the offseason. You do have guys like Greg Van Roten, Dory Jackson, and Azeez Ojulari. I don't really know if you want to bring any of those guys back. Maybe you want to bring back Greg Van Roten as just kind of a veteran depth guy. I think you kind of have to find a replacement, but if you want to bring him back, great. And then Azeez Ojulari is kind of the big question mark. I feel like you have to either decide between Kayvon Thibodeaux and Azeez Ojulari. Both guys play similar positions. Azeez has been a bit more productive when healthy, but you did invest so much more into Kayvon Thibodeaux, so that'll be kind of interesting. But again, outside of that, there really isn't a bunch of money to really spend this offseason outside of course, signing your draft class and maybe bringing back a couple names from your own personal free agents. So if they do bring back a couple guys and you, of course, sign a draft class, you're probably working with roughly 30 to 35 to maybe $40 million in cap space, which is a good number, and honestly, there's a lot of things you can do with that. For starters, let's just kind of go over positions of need for what they can look to address in either the draft or in free agency. On offense, it's of course quarterback. I also do think looking for potentially a change of pace running back, such as, let's just say like a James Conner type of guy for Tyrone Tracy. Definitely not a priority, but if you can find one for cheap, you might want to at least look into it. They might need to look at addressing the receiving core depending on what they do with Darius Slayton. Again, not necessarily a priority, but if you can find a good name, let's say like a Chris Godwin, maybe you would want to do that. Tight end could also be a bit of a positional need as well, because let's be honest, Bellinger isn't great, and maybe Theo Johnson could develop, but that's a little bit interesting. And on the defensive side of the ball, again, I think you do have to decide between Kayvon and Azeez Ojulari. Could you keep both of them 100%? But I just don't think they should invest that much money in those two guys. I think you have to decide between either guy. And then, of course, cornerback is definitely a position of need, and maybe a free safety, but I would say just hold off and wait till next or future years. So that's a lot of positional needs, but again, you do have a good number of assets to kind of find some guys to fill those spots. Now, we're going to start off with the quarterback room first. What could you do to kind of fill in some gaps there? Well, there is one option in free agency that I don't think Giants fans are going to love, but I at least wanted to mention his name, and that is Sam Darnold. Now, Sam Darnold is having a really good resurgence with the Minnesota Vikings, but some people think it's mainly because of Kevin O'Connell's system, and he's probably not going to succeed with the New York Giants. And while me personally, I don't want to give all the credit to O'Connell, I do want to give some credit to Darnold. I also do think that his system is more suited for Sam Darnold, more so than Brian Daboll's system, unless he really decides to ground and pound. I would feel very uncomfortable giving Sam Darnold a 3-year deal worth anything more than like $30 million. That would make me feel really yucky. So unless you're going to give him a 1-year just sort of stopgap type of guy, I don't really know if I love it. But again, if you're not in love with this year's quarterback class and you just want a guy who can start for 1 year and then in 2025 or 2026 you go all in on a quarterback, maybe you should consider it. But I don't know. Like I said, it kind of feels like they have to go all in now. For wide receiver, there's definitely a couple of very interesting names. Again, you don't necessarily need a wide receiver one. You already have that in Malik Neighbors. But some names like Amari Cooper, Chris Godwin, and even maybe Stephon Diggs at this point of his career could definitely be interesting. Of those guys, not really loving most of them because they're a little bit older, but if you could get Amari Cooper, that would be pretty dang nice. And of course, if you could go out there and get a Chris Godwin, who is coming off an injury, but is still less than 30 years of age, and is still a really good quality guy who can play on the inside and outside, maybe you should consider it. Offensive line wise, I don't necessarily know if you have to spend a ton of money on it because you kind of did a lot of that last year. But of course, with Andrew Thomas playing left tackle, I'm supposing that Jermaine Illuminor will be on the team next year at right tackle. You probably want to look at least at addressing the right guard position to get a replacement for Greg Van Roten. When you look at guard, there's really two names that stand out to me. James Daniels is a really good player. I believe he's injured, but he's still a really good player. I would definitely consider him, and he shouldn't cost you all that much. And another name is Kevin Zeitler. He's sort of a 1-year rental type of guy, but he could be something to look at. He's having a really good year for Detroit. Now, in terms of secondary members, there's not a bunch of guys in free agency that I'm really in love with. Carlton Davis from Detroit is a good name, a little bit expensive, but is just a really solid cornerback that you could pair alongside a guy like Drew Phillips. Another name is Charvarius Ward, who is going through something really sad. I'm not going to talk about it here, but it is really sad. He's having a bit of a down year, in my opinion, because of that. But I do think he's a really good player that is deserving of a good-sized contract. DJ Reed is also interesting. He is undersized and is about to be 30 years old, so that is concerning, but he's a really good player, and I don't think they would regret it. Jonathan Jones, Byron Murphy, and a couple other names also do stand out. I think all those guys would be really solid fits. I do think cornerback is a position they should look to address in free agency because there's a bit more surefire guys than the NFL draft. Now let's talk about the NFL draft. There's a couple names in that first round. By the way, they're more than likely going to have a top 3 pick. Currently, I believe they have the 2nd overall pick, and they're probably not going to win another game, so very good chance they get the number 1 pick. Now with the number 1 pick, or the number 2 or 3, whatever they do decide to get, I think quarterback is definitely on the table. Now, unfortunately, quarterback room is not that great this year. Shedeur Sanders would probably be, as of today, my quarterback 1. He's the most surefire guy. But at the same time, I just don't know what his ceiling truly is. He kind of feels like somebody that could be a top 15 level quarterback, but never really entering those top 10 discussions. I don't want to compare him to Jared Goff because I do think Goff is a top 10 quarterback, but kind of would remind me a little bit of like the LA Rams version of Jared Goff, if you kind of get my points. Somebody who's a good quarterback who may have a couple of debates to be a top 10 quarterback, but is really around that 20 to 10 range for most of their career. Again, I could be wrong. There's still a lot of time to see him develop. He could be fantastic for all we know, but he just doesn't inspire me as much as like a Caleb Williams, Drake May, or Jaden Daniels did last year. Then you have Cam Ward, who is also interesting, but I'm not a huge fan either. He seems like a really big developmental project, and that's not really something that Brian Daboll, in my opinion, can afford to really sit there and develop a guy. I will say Cam Ward does have some insane potential, so maybe you just want to take a flyer on him. He has a good-sized arm. He does make a lot of big plays, some boneheaded plays, but he's a good project quarterback that I do think is worthy of a first-round pick, but I just don't know if this Giants team can seriously develop him. And then outside of him, I don't think there's another quarterback I would take in the top 5. Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck, Jalen Milroe, Garrett Nussmeier, Dylan Gabriel, those guys are all second, third, fourth round picks and beyond. I don't think you take them in the top 5. So yeah, you're kind of picking between Shedeur and Cam Ward, and I would probably lean towards Shedeur, to be honest with you. In the second round, there's a bunch of really good names out there. I would say my number 1 target, if they can't address cornerback in free agency, would be Jahdae Barron from Texas. He's an older guy, but is a Jim Thorpe finalist, can play safety, can play inside the box, can play, some nickel. Primarily want to play more than likely corner, but again, has that versatility to play whatever position they need him. He's not the greatest size-wise nor speed-wise, but is just really smart, has really good technique, isn't going to commit a bunch of dumb plays. He's not going to give up big plays behind him. He's just a really solid cornerback that I think would be a fantastic fit. There is some other names out there that I think this team could definitely consider. There's Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, who's having a really good year. He has a PFF grade of 91.8, has only given up 1 sack, does typically play at left tackle, but with the Buffaloes, North Dakota State, he has played right tackle and guard in years past. He could be somebody who could be kind of a second round steal that you could plug and play early in his first year in the NFL. I think you'd probably move him to right guard, which he doesn't have much experience in, but he did play left guard, so there's a lot of versatility with this guy. I think he would also make a bunch of sense. Some other names you could also throw out there would be guys like Darian Porter. If you want to go with like a running back, maybe a Dylan Sampson. Gunnar Helm from Texas could be a second round pick here. I think those are all some pretty good names. Then in the third round, I think you just look at all of your positions of need and just find the best overall talent on the board, whether that is a guy like a Kevin Winston from Penn State, Alfred Collins from Texas. I just think you got to go whatever position you need, just take the best guy that's available on the board. Doesn't really matter the position, just take the best talent. This team just needs a massive inflection of talents. So as we talked about in this video, the Giants are a bad team, but they have a decent foundation to work with. You have Malik Neighbors, you have Andrew Thomas, Tyrone Tracy's a pretty good player. I like Andrew Phillips, I like Dexter Lawrence, I like Brian Burns, I think Bobby Okereke is pretty good. So this team isn't terribly far from being at least a respectable team. I like Brian Daboll, and I think he's a good, relatively head coach. So I think this team has the right guys, just got to make it work. This has to be an all-in season or else he's going to get fired and they're going to have to go another direction yet again. But if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. And I love you guys. Peace.